Hi everyone and welcome back. As I mentioned yesterday, we're going to begin with structure. And first, we're going to have a look at questions. Now, the reason why I started with auxiliary verbs, which were the verb tenses and modals, is because to form a question or to form a statement or sentence in English is quite different than in other languages. In English, the structure of a statement and the structure of a question are different because of the auxiliary verb. Our subjects are not always conjugated to the auxiliary verb, so you need to have it in your mind before you ask a question, for example. So let's look at the types of questions and how to respond. First, we have the yes or no question. The formula for this is going to be the auxiliary verb plus the subject plus the main verb plus any objective content. Now, this can be a little difficult in examples. We have, do your cats help with classes? Next, we have, does Ty help with classes? You would need to know already that they do or she does. Now, the structure for a response depends on the situation. It is perfectly acceptable to say either yes, no, or maybe in the English language a little informally, but to be a little more proper, you can answer with the auxiliary verb. Now, we don't use the main verb, we use the auxiliary verb in return. Let's look at another example. Are your cats helping with classes? No. Or, no, they aren't. Next. Are your cats helping with your ratings? Yes, or yes they are. So keep this in mind as we go along, and remember that you need to study all of the auxiliary verbs in order to conjugate, because in the format of a question, you will need to conjugate to the subject before you ask that question. Great. So of course, things don't always stay so simple or easy. With the next type of question, which are information questions, we are going to have to add a new formula with a question word. And we will go over each question word one at a time. So first, let's look at the structure. We have two possibilities. The question word plus the auxiliary verb plus the subject plus the main verb plus any objective content. But also we can have a noun that accompanies that auxiliary verb. You'll see as we move on with each question word. But in a response, remember, these are information questions, so we need to give the information that's requested in return. This can be simply a fragment, or it can be a complete sentence. Before I give any examples, let's look at each question word one at a time. Now, to represent time, we use when. For example, when can we see the cats again? And a typical response, they are practicing for an upcoming episode now. That was in a complete sentence. So with when, remember, time. Next, to represent location, we have where. Now, an example, where do you live? I live in São Paulo, or you can just answer in São Paulo. But to represent a location or a place, where is our word. Next, to represent reason, we have why. Now, as you might know, why is accompanied with because. So, for an example, why should we learn English? Because it's the common language used throughout the world. So, to represent manner, we get to how. How are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. Now, how has several combinations that mean different things. So let's look at each one separately. First, we have two synonyms that are used in different ways. How much and how many. Now, how much will represent uncountable nouns. How many will represent countable nouns. So that lesson on nouns will be coming very soon. First, let's look at how much. How much water do you drink every day? 8 glasses. Let's look at how many. How many glasses of water do you drink every day? 8 glasses. So we will discuss a little more about these non-count nouns in the future. Next, we have how old. Now, this represents age, and it's not offensive because you're asking old in terms of years, not in terms of youth. For example, how old are you? Oh, I'm as old as you think I am. But I'm kidding. However, please note that in English, we use the verb to be to represent years. I am 34 years old. Next, how soon? This represents time with urgency. It's used in place of when you need something a little more exact. For example, how soon can you get to the hospital? I really need you. In 10 minutes. Next, how hot or how cold is asking temperature, but it depends on the situation. If it's cold outside, if it's hot outside, whichever type of temperature you're asking. For example, it is becoming winter, so I would say, how cold is it outside? In the northern hemisphere, we would of course ask, how hot is it outside? Next, we have how fast. Now, this represents speed. How fast were you driving when you got into that wreck? Moving on, we have 3 of the most important combinations. Now, the first is how often. Now, this represents frequency. And if you remember from our lessons about verb tenses, the simple present also represents frequency. So these are used often together. For example, how often do you give English classes? Every day. Now, please note that in terms of frequency, as I described, we would answer similarly than we would making a statement about something in simple present. Next, we have how long. Now, this also represents something similar to a verb tense, which is duration of time. Now, if you remember, the present perfect continuous represents also a duration of time. So they're commonly used together. For example, how long have you been teaching English? For 10 years. Now, take a note. We use since or for in the response, as I described in those adverbs from our previous lessons. Next, we have how far. Now, this represents distance, and it can be physical distance or it can be mental distance. For example, how far is it from São Paulo to Rio de Janeiro? Around 600 kilometers. But how far would you go to be the best teacher ever? Oh, I would love to help everyone, so I'm not sure. Good. Let's move on. Next, we have who. Now, who represents a person, but only in the subject? For example, who is my teacher? Jeffrey. Moving on, we have whom. Now, whom represents a person in the objective. For example, to whom are you speaking? My mom. Now, I don't want you to worry too much about whom. Informally, who is acceptable to replace whom? For example, who are you speaking to? My mom. So just keep in mind that whom will be important to remember with objects of prepositions. We went with whom the guide said would lead us the best. Let's move on to what. Now, what alone represents things. And when you add a form of do to what, it represents activities. So it's best defined as representing things or activities. For example, what is that? It's a pointer. What do you use it for? To make the magic words appear. In addition, what can also have several combinations. So let's look at each one of these. First, we have what kind. Now this represents type. We can also say what type or what sort, but in general, what kind is the most commonly used. So, for example, what kind of cats do you have? They are ragdolls. Next, let's look at how what can be used to represent certain traits. Now, when we use what plus be like, that's going to represent personality traits. When we use what plus look like, that's going to represent physical descriptions. Let me give you two examples. First, what is Ty like? Oh, she's sweet, nice, and well-behaved. What does my look like? He's very big, very fluffy, with blue eyes and lighter color points. He's very cute. And now, let's look at how what can be used with nouns. That was that second structure that we were talking about before. What plus time is going to ask the actual current time. So what time is it, for example? It's 5 o'clock somewhere. But however, try not to confuse what plus a noun with our last question word, I promise. Which. Now, which represents a choice from a known group. And sometimes what plus a noun can be a synonym to which, but sometimes not. Now, which alone is used instead of what when the choice is from a known group that you can select from. Which umbrella do you like more? The red or the black? I like the red umbrella. Now the cases when what and which are the same depend on the situation. For example, what class did you take? English. Which class did you take? English. The only difference is the question is asking what as in general or which as in a specific group of possibilities, and in this case, classes. So let's review again all of the formulas to create questions. Now remember we have the yes or no questions. That's going to be auxiliary verb plus subject plus main verb plus any objects. With information questions, remember that we add that question word in front of the auxiliary verb but also can have an accompanying noun. And I know that was a lot to cover in one class, but I wanted to arrive at a good point where we can bring everything together in order for you to understand why we have this order in English class. In our next lesson, we will look at the types of questions in other formats. For example, negative questions, tag questions, and avoiding double negatives. And you can share with whomever you think will benefit from these classes. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.